Sanguine Sanctum. A golden placard with particularly conspicuous symbols that lay among the treasures caught his eye, and upon comparing it with a stencil, it did indeed resemble their previous finds. Here is another one. It looks like some sort of informative sign. Very splendorous. He walked towards the stone altar, placard in his gentle hands, where all their corresponding artifacts were. Presiding over them stood Professor Osmond. Very good. Hopefully something new. They had a thing for decorations, it seems. I cannot wager whether it be a significant or mundane piece. Oh, I would agree. But I understand their fascinations. See here, these flowing patterns with punctuations all over. Another examples of their influence from the heavens. He contorted his face in slight confusion at what the professor said. It bothers me how a completely submerged civilization is in possession of such a vast number of cosmic references. Fascinating, is it not? He turned to behold the mysterious chalice placed neatly upon the grand and decorative altar. Candles had already been burning upon first discovering it, or so he had been told. Hey, Frederick, bring the reference chart, would you? He was called upon by one of his fellow students. He retrieved said piece upon his beckoning and walked over to the man huddled over a piece of armor remnants. At his side lay an array of examination tools, brushes, small picks and containers for lesser items. He was dusting off an old armor laying like a body should inhabit it, but there was none within. Here, I think it is another symbol. A decorative gauntlet was the point of interest. It appeared in a more ceremonial fashion than fit for combat, unlike the rest of the accoutrements. Engraved on top of the hand was the symbol of his interest, but in a slight variation. An engraving of curving lines winding downwards on the gauntlet. They cross with one another over and under, resembling a flowing liquid. He looked down to his references. Oh, yes. Wait, I just remembered. Osmond! He hurried back to his mentor at the table. There he rummaged around for the sketch from his recollection. There are a lot of resemblance now to this pattern and the chalice symbol. He placed several pieces of notes next to each other. He demonstrated the various nature of iconography they had discovered, their similarities, and at times their unification. Symbols that resemble chalices, but other more elusive runes that they had only managed to interpret from vague scripts and relations. Osmond's eyes lit up at the recognition of it. A link, it would appear. Here, let's see. Yes. Oh, if you examine these, and these. He pointed to the notes and rearranged some while providing his explanation. Calyces, or chalice. Here, this one has been obvious. You surely would know it by now? Sanguis. Blood. Indeed. But here, This edition, as you pointed out, commonly appears with sanguis. He dragged another set of sketches onto the ensemble. You see how there are dots in these ones? They only appear in unison when the calicis and sanguis are connected. I believe it creates the term clavis, but only in addition to calicis. Then they create the meaning of key. A key? Well, it's not just so simple. If I am under the right impression, it would be more akin to a key for a key. What? That is rather confusing. What for? Osmond donned his round glasses and rested them on his nose while pulling up a blank parchment. See here. This is the chalice symbol that appears on the layout mural. He drew a quick image of the chalice symbol with a piece of charcoal. The script is intricate. If we pick apart what appears on the mural, we get the aforementioned calicis and this one, Yanwa. He added the two parallel sets of diagonal crossing lines in both directions over the chalice, creating a little rhombus space in the middle where they crossed. Entrance. In need of a key. Notice how the two almost create the shape of a passage here. But from where do you conclude the use of a key? Osmond smiled trickily. You see, we might not be in the search of a literal key, but this pattern here. He added the following pattern of liquid likeness they recently discovered and drew them from up to down in between the crossing lines and converged in the top of the chalice, as if being poured into it. Rather randomly, he pointed up to one of the many skeletal bodies hanging upside down from the ceiling, arms tied below their heads like an animal. You see the Thumerians' fixation with blood. Its importance to their culture has its signs strewn all over. So much so they even procured it in such a manner. Ah, yes. It makes me think of the fair maiden. Osmond bobbed his head like the comment provoked him to laugh, but he did not utter a sound. Of course. It raises the question if such myths originated all the way back in the Sumerian era. But since the fair maiden's blood supposedly cured the old plague, I find it hard to place the correlation. None of these carcasses seem to have had any cultural pedigree to note. They appear as anyone, slaves even. But your observation is curious nonetheless. This strange practice might have originated from the conception of the maiden's healing blood. The two of them were left staring upon the hanging corpses with their black skeletal eyes gazing out into nothing. Eventually he turned back to Osmond, having had his nerves tested long enough. So blood was like a key to them? Now Osmond lost his unerring mannerism and started to scratch his bearded chin. I dare say it is not quite as simple as just blood. Not any blood would do, but I'm not sure. Perhaps it was. As you can see, there are these lines with dots at the top. He pointed to the original image. They are new for this piece, and we have yet to discover their meaning. It is my belief they hold a meaning that adds new context to the interpretation of Sanguis. Perhaps you could look around, expand the archive a bit. I myself would like to delve deeper into the practice of these hanging figures. I do believe they may be illustrated in that symbol depicted all over the place.
Here it is. This one has not been opened before.
Frederick pointed haughtily towards the queer door of the labyrinth. The two protectors shared brief glances amongst themselves before one stepped forward to lift it up. From behind the back of the large man, he could only make out the first set of steps in the beginning to another staircase that descended far enough for the darkness to swallow it up.
There we are.
The man who had effortlessly hauled the door open turned back to him.
You know the drill. We have our job and you have yours. Let's not get in each other's way.
He had no issue to comply and nodded stiffly. He was content with never ever encountering the horrors he only had heard of. But for the sake of their studies, one must brave such frontiers. The tall and lanky man, who had previously introduced himself as Cromley, held his torch in front of him to begin the descent. The second protector, Vitus, patiently waited for him to follow downwards. After a lengthy walk in the oppressive incline corridor, they entered into a large room where the floor was not laid with the common stone bricks, but rather was covered in dirt and wet puddles. Vines of unknown nature slithered around the walls here and there. The space was in a rectangular shape, with them emerging on the short end, peering into the long darkness in front of them. A skittering mass covered the murkiness that was the opposite wall. In the darkness, one could only make out movements and no definitive nature. Barely even a sound was heard. Cromley stopped and stared straight ahead, his whole form tensing up. Overgrown rats, the size of dogs, emerged, accompanied by a faint tapping of gross, skittering feet hitting wet soil. They moved rather aggressively, with huge front teeth and bulging eyes. Frederick slipped back behind Vitus, in through the arching opening to take shelter. The two protectors each flanked the group of rats, gaining their attention. Vitus swooped in with an unsightly sweep of his metal piece. Somehow he managed to extend it mid-swing into a shape that appeared unrealistic for its properties. Granted, it was dark and the machinations were hard to perceive, but he could swing around the metal chunk he carried like a thick, overgrown whip. It threw many of the rats clear into the wall, of which the few that remained jumped away while squealing angrily. After leapt Cromley with his large, curved tool, to brutally slice into their putrid bodies. Having turned away from the bloodshed, Frederick eventually heard a low snigger.
Yes, rats.
Nasty vermin. Even infects the labyrinth, it seems. The two conversed casually, standing over their slaughtered prey. But I had never seen rats that huge, Frederick disgustedly proclaimed while emerging from his hideaway.
A nice change instead of those other things. Rather a huge sodden rat than a guardian.
Hopefully, Frederick thought, he would never have to witness one of said guardians, since horrifying giant rats were so much more preferred. Let's move on then. They both turned to light up the end of the chamber. Another arching opening presented itself, with light emerging from within. The next room was rather small, a square chamber with one of the womanly statues reaching from the floor to the ceiling, positioned in the center of the innermost wall. It was a stark contrast to the filthy and grimy approach. Candles provided a well-lit space of fine masonry. The chamber itself was about 13 feet by 13 feet. The two protectors positioned themselves on each side of the entryway and peeked inside, looking over at the other wall. It was their indicative glances back at him that caused him to enter. There was a long stone table covering the span of the entire wall and about the height to his chest before the statue, making the figure appear as if conducting business by the aforementioned table, on which stood candle holders, some urns and metal bowls. Murals were carved over its surface, and he immediately became excited as he saw another chalice amongst them. He approached to inspect, and found that many of the bowls all had a darkened layer of grime. It intrigued him, and he recovered his tools. He scraped in the strange crust to find it not at all dried, rather the sludge remains of a vessel that once upon a time could only have held blood. He instantly thought of their previous revelation, Sanguis. He looked at the murals and examined it more closely. It depicted many humanoid shapes in the lower row of the image as a whole. A vast empty space covered the upper reaches, but in the middle he thought to make out new shapes. A gap was left in the row of figures that gave way to a flowing pattern that emerged out of nothing. There was only a rune, the same rune of mysterious meaning with dotted lines. His eyes followed along the indication down to the table, where he instead began to examine the clutter. Every bowl and the chalice all contained the same traces of blood, but the chalice was etched with a curious rune. 3 lines with 1 dot over each of them. He recognized the shape from the script they used in interpreting the Sumerian language, being the oldest recorded use of letters which had uncanny parallels to their finds in the labyrinth, and recalled the shape with dots and lines holding divine significance. Since no spoken words could be derived from the Sumerians themselves, they reconstructed a possible suggestion from these letters, likely the remnant of this more ancient speech, creating the word Sanctus. Sanctus, he read out in a low whisper. He rummaged around for his personal stencil and made a short comparison. It was but a crude translation, and he had no direct confirmation as of now, but in the back of his head, he knew it to be right. The key was simply sanguine sanctum, holy blood, and with what little remained in the cups, further ingredients could surely be produced.
Ritual blood. Material used in a holy chalice ritual. One of the basic ingredients used to satiate the holy chalice is this incoagulable blood. When all is melted in blood, all is reborn.